The first thing people noticed about Elias Thornwell was not his face, which remained largely concealed beneath the wide brim of a black cavalry hat, nor his height, which was considerable at 6 feet and 3 inches, but rather the crossed gun belts he wore at his waist, 2 holsters positioned in an X pattern across his hips, each containing a Colt 1851 Navy revolver valued at $22 apiece when purchased new from the Hartford factory. The pistols were immaculate despite their evident use, the steel polished to a dull sheen that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, giving them an appearance of objects that existed slightly outside the normal spectrum of material things. In the left breast pocket of his long black coat, he carried a letter bearing the seal of President Abraham Lincoln. The document, dated April 18, 1865, authorized the bearer to enforce by any means necessary the immediate emancipation of all enslaved persons in accordance with the recently ratified 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. The letter was signed by Lincoln himself, though by the time Thornwell received it in late April, the president had been dead for 3 days, shot in Ford's Theater by an actor with delusions of grandeur and a single-shot derringer. The letter's authority derived from a dead man, enforced by a living one who seemed to have stepped from some darker reality where violence was not merely permitted, but required. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories, and comment which city you're watching from. Let's continue. Thornwell arrived in Wilcox County, Alabama on May 4, 1865, riding a black gelding that showed signs of hard travel. The horse was 17 hands high and utterly silent. No whinnying, no stamping, just the steady rhythm of hooves on packed dirt. The county seat of Camden was a town of approximately 1,200 souls before the war, though that number had declined considerably as young men departed for Confederate service and never returned. The streets were quiet in the afternoon heat, the kind of oppressive southern warmth that made even breathing feel like labor. He stopped first at the courthouse, a 2-story brick building that served as the center of civil authority for the county. The clerk, a thin man named Pemberton who had survived Shiloh by virtue of a childhood injury that left him with a permanent limp, looked up from his ledgers as Thornwell entered and felt immediate unease. There was something wrong about the man who stood in the doorway, something that had nothing to do with the obvious symbols of authority he carried, and everything to do with a quality that Pemberton, who had seen considerable death in his military service, recognized as the mark of someone who had moved beyond the normal boundaries of human behavior. "I need a list of all plantation owners within 20 miles of Camden who have not yet complied with emancipation orders," Thornwell said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. Pemberton had expected anger or righteousness, but this calm statement of purpose suggested something more methodical. "Sir, most folks around here are still adjusting to the new situation," Pemberton began carefully. "The war ended barely a month ago, and communication has been difficult. Many plantation owners haven't received official notification." "I am the official notification." Thornwell placed the presidential letter on the clerk's desk. "You have 2 hours to provide the list. I will be at the hotel." The document bore Lincoln's signature, unmistakable even to someone who had never seen it before. Pemberton stared at it for a long moment before looking up, but Thornwell had already departed, leaving only the faint smell of gun oil and something else, something organic and unpleasant that Pemberton couldn't quite identify. By late afternoon, Pemberton had compiled a list of 17 plantation owners who had not freed their enslaved workers, either through deliberate refusal or because they claimed ignorance of the new legal requirements. He delivered the list personally to the Camden Hotel, where he found Thornwell sitting in the lobby, absolutely motionless, staring at nothing. The stillness was disturbing. Normal people fidgeted, shifted weight, breathed visibly. Thornwell did none of these things. He simply existed in perfect immobility until Pemberton cleared his throat, at which point Thornwell's head turned with mechanical precision. 17 names, Pemberton said, handing over the papers. I've marked the ones who are likely to resist. Most of them are, well, they're not reasonable men, sir. Reasonable men don't require my services. Thornwell stood in a single, fluid motion, taking the list. I'll begin with the closest. That would be the Wardlaw plantation, correct? Yes, sir. About 6 miles south. Colonel Wardlaw was a regimental commander. He came back from Virginia last month with about 50 men who never officially mustered out. He's well armed and doesn't acknowledge federal authority. He will. Thornwell walked past Pemberton toward the door, then paused. I recommend you stay indoors this evening. What I do is legal, but it's not pleasant to witness. He rode out as the sun touched the horizon, heading south on the river road that connected Camden to the scattered plantations along the Alabama River. The Wardlaw estate, known locally as Magnolia Grove, consisted of 2,800 acres worked by approximately 140 enslaved people before the war. Current numbers were unknown, as Wardlaw had reportedly been purchasing slaves from departing plantation owners at deeply discounted prices, apparently believing the Confederacy would somehow rise again and restore the old order. Thornwell arrived at the plantation gates as darkness fell. 2 guards stood at the entrance, both wearing remnants of Confederate uniforms and carrying rifled muskets. They saw him coming from perhaps 50 yards away, watched his approach with the kind of lazy confidence that comes from believing oneself secure in superior numbers and defensive position. Roads closed. One guard called out when Thornwell was within speaking distance. Colonel Wardlaw isn't receiving visitors. Thornwell said nothing. He simply continued riding forward at the same steady pace. I said roads closed. The guard raised his musket. You turn around right now, or... The distance was approximately 20 yards. Thornwell's right hand moved with speed that seemed physically impossible, drawing the pistol from its holster and firing in a single motion that took perhaps half a second from start to finish. The sound was enormous in the quiet evening, a sharp crack followed by rolling echoes. The guard who had spoken dropped his musket and collapsed, clutching his shoulder where Thornwell's bullet had shattered bone and torn through muscle. The second guard fired his musket, but panic destroyed his aim. The shot went wide by 3 feet. Before he could begin reloading, a process that would take a competent soldier perhaps 15 seconds, Thornwell had closed the distance and brought his horse alongside. He didn't dismount. He simply reached down, grabbed the guard by his collar, and threw him with such force that the man flew 6 feet before hitting the ground hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. Fetch your colonel, Thornwell said to the injured guard, who was staring at his ruined shoulder in shock. Tell him the United States government has arrived. 10 minutes later, Colonel Marcus Wardlaw stood on the front porch of his plantation house, surrounded by 8 armed men, facing Elias Thornwell, who sat perfectly still on his horse just beyond pistol range. Wardlaw was a thick man of 53 years, with the florid complexion of someone who drank heavily and the bearing of someone accustomed to unquestioned authority within his sphere of influence. I don't know who you are or what authority you claim, Wardlaw called out. But this is private property, and you've assaulted 2 of my men. I'd be within my rights to have you shot where you stand. Thornwell reached into his coat and withdrew the presidential letter, holding it up. This document orders the immediate emancipation of all enslaved persons on this property. You have until dawn tomorrow to comply. Any person held in bondage after that time makes you subject to arrest and prosecution under federal law. Wardlaw laughed, a sound without genuine mirth. Lincoln's dead, you fool. Your piece of paper died with him, and even if it didn't, there's no federal authority in Alabama anymore. The United States government abandoned this region when it prosecuted an illegal war against sovereign states. So you can take your letter and your threats and ride back to wherever you came from, or you can die here. Your choice is simple. Wrong. Thornwell's voice remained quiet. Your choice is simple. You can comply with the law and live, or you can resist and die. There is no third option. You're one man. Wardlaw's voice rose with anger. I have 50 armed veterans on this property. You think you can... Thornwell drew both pistols in a motion so fast that several of the men on the porch flinched involuntarily. He fired 4 times, the shots coming so rapidly they almost blended into a single extended crack of thunder. The first bullet shattered the lantern hanging beside the front door, plunging the porch into darkness. The second destroyed a decorative column, sending splinters of wood flying. The third punched through a window, creating a spiderweb of cracks in the expensive glass. The fourth removed the hat from Wardlaw's head without touching him, the hat spinning away into the darkness. In the sudden silence that followed, Thornwell spoke again. I have 12 rounds remaining. I've killed men at 300 yards with these pistols. Every man on that porch is within 50 yards. Do you understand mathematics, Colonel? I can kill all of you before any of you can reload. Or you can comply with federal law and live. You have until dawn. He turned his horse and rode back into the darkness, leaving behind 8 men who suddenly understood they were dealing with something far outside their experience. One of them muttered something about sending for help from neighboring plantations. Wardlaw silenced him with a sharp gesture. That man isn't human, the colonel said quietly. I've seen men who enjoy killing, and I've seen men who kill out of duty. That's something else. That's something worse. What Wardlaw didn't know, what no one except the enslaved people in the quarters knew, was that Thornwell hadn't left. He'd simply circled around in the darkness and positioned himself within sight of the quarters where approximately 140 people waited, uncertain of what morning would bring. They saw him there, a dark shape on horseback, completely motionless beneath the stars. They understood that he was standing watch, ensuring that no one was moved or hidden before dawn, and several of the older people began to weep quietly, not from fear but from something else, something they'd almost forgotten was possible. Dawn came with mist rising from the river. Thornwell rode back to the main house to find Wardlaw waiting on the porch, alone this time, without his armed men. The colonel looked like he hadn't slept, which was probably accurate. I've decided to comply, Wardlaw said, his voice carefully neutral. My people are free to go. I'll provide documentation for any who want it. All of them, now. I'll watch while you tell them. Thornwell's tone suggested this was not negotiable. What followed was a scene that would be described in whispered conversations for decades. Wardlaw walked to the quarters and, in a voice that shook with suppressed rage and humiliation, announced that everyone was free to leave. Some people cheered. Others stood in stunned silence. A few began gathering belongings immediately, as if afraid the offer would be rescinded. And through it all, Elias Thornwell sat on his horse, watching, saying nothing, the pistols at his waist catching the early light. By noon, roughly half of the formerly enslaved people had departed, most heading toward Camden, where they'd heard there was a Freedmen's Bureau office that could provide assistance. The others remained, uncertain where to go or what to do, and Thornwell spent several hours speaking with them, providing information about resources and options in a voice that was surprisingly gentle when not delivering threats. When he finally rode away from Magnolia Grove in mid-afternoon, he left behind a plantation in chaos, fields untended, the remaining workers uncertain of their status, and Marcus Wardlaw sitting on his porch staring at nothing, understanding that the world he'd known had ended, not with the Confederacy's surrender, but with the arrival of a man who enforced the law with such methodical violence that resistance became unthinkable. The second plantation on Pemberton's list belonged to a widow named Constance Fairchild, who ran 1,400 acres with the help of her 2 adult sons and approximately 70 enslaved workers. The Fairchild place was 12 miles west of Camden, accessible by a road that degraded into barely more than a trail for the last 3 miles. Thornwell arrived at sunset to find the main house dark and apparently empty. He dismounted and walked to the front door, which hung slightly open. The smell hit him immediately. Decay, recent but not fresh, perhaps 3 or 4 days old. He drew one pistol and pushed the door fully open, stepping inside with the kind of careful precision that suggested extensive experience with potentially hostile environments. Constance Fairchild lay in the parlor, still seated in her chair, dead from a single gunshot wound to the head. The pistol that had delivered the shot lay on the floor beside her. Her sons were upstairs, each in their own rooms, each dead from similar wounds. Thornwell examined the scenes with clinical detachment, noting details that told a story: the lack of struggle, the positioning suggesting they'd all been shot while sitting or lying down, the caliber of the weapon used. He found the answer in the kitchen, where an elderly enslaved man named Moses sat at the table, staring at nothing. The old man looked up as Thornwell entered, showing no surprise or fear. "They said the war was over, but nothing changed," Moses said quietly. "Miss Constance, she announced we was all still property, that Lincoln being dead meant the old ways was back. Her boys, they agreed, started talking about selling some of the younger folks down to Florida, said there was still markets there." He paused, hands trembling slightly. "I killed them, all 3. Used the Colonel's old service pistol he kept in his study. Then I sat here waiting for someone to come." Thornwell holstered his pistol and pulled out a chair, sitting across from Moses. "How old are you?" 76, best I can figure. Been on this place since I was born." "You're free now. The 13th Amendment makes slavery illegal throughout the United States. Constance Fairchild had no authority to keep you or anyone else in bondage." Moses laughed bitterly. "Free? What does that mean for a man my age who can't read or write, who owns nothing, who knows how to do nothing except pick cotton? Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do?" "Whatever you want." Thornwell stood. "And you won't be prosecuted for killing them. You acted in self-defense against people attempting to illegally enslave you. That's justified under federal law. You can do that. Just decide I ain't guilty. I'm authorized to enforce emancipation by any means necessary. That includes protecting people who defended themselves against illegal captivity." Thornwell walked to the door, then paused. "There are 69 other people on this property. You need to tell them they're free and help them get organized. Some will want to leave, others will want to stay and work the land as free laborers. That's their choice now. Can you do that?" Moses stood slowly, staring at Thornwell with something approaching wonder. "Who are you?" "Someone who delivers messages." Thornwell walked out into the fading light, leaving Moses to process the reality that he had killed 3 white people and would face no consequences. That the world had changed so fundamentally that the old rules no longer applied. That freedom was real, even if its meaning remained unclear. The third plantation was where Thornwell's reputation truly began to spread. The Howell estate, 3 to 1,900 acres worked by 180 enslaved people, was owned by brothers named Jonathan and Samuel Howell, who had returned from the war with their private militia intact. 23 men who had served together throughout the conflict and who had no intention of acknowledging defeat or complying with emancipation orders. Thornwell arrived at the Howell estate on May 7th to find it fortified like a military installation. Guards at every entrance, sentries walking the perimeter, and the main house surrounded by defensive positions. The brothers had clearly been warned about his approach and had prepared accordingly. He stopped at the gate, where 4 armed men pointed rifles at him. "I'm here to deliver notice of emancipation under federal authority," Thornwell called out. "I need to speak with the Howell brothers." "They ain't interested in speaking with you," one guard replied. "And if you don't turn around right now, We're gonna shoot your horse out from under you and drag you inside for questioning about who sent you and what your real purpose is." Thornwell nodded slowly, as if considering this. Then he drew both pistols and shot all 4 guards in the span of perhaps 3 seconds. Not killed, he aimed for shoulders and legs, disabling shots that left them screaming but alive. Before anyone in the main compound could react, he dismounted, gathered the guards' rifles, and taken cover behind a large oak tree near the gate. "Jonathan Howell," he shouted toward the house. "Samuel Howell, you have 1 hour to release every enslaved person on this property and provide them with documentation of their freedom. If you comply, I leave peacefully. If you resist, I will kill every man in this compound who raises a weapon against me, and then I will burn your house to the ground with you inside it. This is your only warning." The response came in the form of rifle fire, perhaps a dozen shots that splintered bark and tore through leaves, but came nowhere near Thornwell, who had chosen his position with obvious expertise. He waited until the volley ended, counted to 10, then moved to a different position with such speed and silence that the shooters in the house had no target when they tried to fire again. What followed was a siege that lasted 6 hours and became legendary throughout the county. Thornwell moved constantly, never staying in one position for more than a minute, firing when he had clear targets and conserving ammunition when he didn't. He killed 3 men in the first hour, all clean headshots from distances exceeding 100 yards. He wounded 7 others, and through it all, he maintained a running commentary, calling out to the Howell brothers with information about their defensive weaknesses, pointing out which positions were exposed, which men were poorly trained, which tactical decisions were incompetent. "Samuel Howell, you have a man in the second-floor window on the east side," Thornwell called out after his 5th kill. "He's standing too far forward. I can see his shadow on the wall behind him. He has about 30 seconds before I put a bullet through his skull. You might want to tell him to move." The man didn't move, either because he didn't hear the warning or because he didn't believe it. 28 seconds later, Thornwell's bullet removed the top of his head and his body collapsed backward into the room. "You're running low on ammunition," Thornwell continued. "I've counted approximately 140 shots fired from your position. Most of your men are carrying muzzle-loading rifles that hold a single shot. Some have repeating rifles, but not many. I have 2 Colt Navy revolvers, 12 shots total, and I've fired 6. I also have 4 additional loaded cylinders in my coat, giving me a total of 36 rounds remaining. I've killed 6 men with 6 shots. You have 17 men left who are capable of fighting. Do you understand what happens next?" The firing from the house had stopped. In the silence, Thornwell heard voices arguing, though he couldn't make out the words. 5 minutes passed. Then Jonathan Howell appeared on the porch, hands raised. "We surrender," he called out. "We'll comply with the emancipation order. Just stop shooting. Tell your men to throw their weapons out the windows, all of them. If I see anyone holding a firearm when I approach, I'll assume the surrender is false and act accordingly." Rifles began clattering onto the ground. Thornwell counted them carefully, 19 weapons, which matched his estimate of how many men remained. He waited another 5 minutes, watching for any movement that suggested treachery, then walked toward the house with both pistols drawn. Jonathan and Samuel Howell stood on the porch, looking at the man who had held off their entire force for 6 hours. Up close, they could see details that hadn't been visible from a distance. The absolute steadiness of Thornwell's hands, the complete absence of heavy breathing or signs of exertion, the cold emptiness in his eyes that suggested whatever made him human had been burned out long ago. "Who are you?" Jonathan asked quietly. "Someone who enforces the law." Thornwell holstered one pistol but kept the other drawn. "Release every enslaved person on this property. Now, I'll watch." The process took 3 hours. 180 people gathered their belongings and either departed immediately or arranged to stay as free workers with negotiated wages. Through it all, Thornwell stood watch, ensuring no coercion occurred, no threats were made, no attempts to hide anyone or falsify numbers. When it was finished, he walked back to his horse, mounted, and rode away without another word. Behind him he left 6 dead men, 12 wounded, and 2 brothers who would spend the rest of their lives telling stories about the man who had single-handedly destroyed their private army. By the end of May 1865, Elias Thornwell had visited all 17 plantations on Pemberton's original list. 12 had complied peacefully after witnessing what had happened at the Wardlaw, Fairchild, and Howell estates. The remaining 5 had resisted with varying degrees of violence. Thornwell had killed 14 men total, wounded 23 others, and burned 2 plantation houses to the ground when their owners refused to emerge and release their enslaved workers. The formerly enslaved people called him Deliverer and the Angel of Death, in equal measure. He brought freedom, but he brought it through violence so methodical and efficient that it bordered on supernatural. White society called him the official executor, a title that acknowledged both his legal authority and his willingness to kill in service of that authority. But there were rumors, whispered conversations that suggested something darker beneath the official story. People noticed that Thornwell never ate in public, that he was never seen drinking water, that his horse never needed rest, despite traveling enormous distances. They noticed that he seemed to know things he couldn't possibly know. Which plantations were hiding enslaved people, which owners were planning to flee with their property before he arrived, which communities were organizing armed resistance. The truth, known only to a very few, was considerably stranger than the rumors suggested. Elias Thornwell had died in 1863. He'd been killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville, shot through the chest by a Confederate bullet that tore through his lung and lodged against his spine. He'd lain in a field hospital for 6 hours while the surgeons attended to men who had better chances of survival, and he'd died sometime near dawn, alone and largely unmourned. But 3 days later he'd opened his eyes in a mass grave outside Fredericksburg, surrounded by the bodies of other Union dead awaiting burial. He'd climbed out of that pit with no memory of the intervening time and with a wound that should have killed him, but which had somehow closed itself, leaving only a star-shaped scar over his heart. He'd returned to his unit claiming to have been captured and escaped, a lie accepted because the chaos of the battle made verification impossible. But he knew something was wrong. He felt no hunger, no thirst, no fatigue. He could go days without sleep and weeks without food. His senses had become preternaturally acute. He could hear conversations from 50 yards away, track movement in complete darkness, smell blood at distances that should have been impossible. And he felt nothing. No fear, no anger, no joy, no sorrow. The emotions that had defined his existence before Chancellorsville had simply ceased, leaving behind only a cold emptiness and a single driving purpose: to enforce the law that had freed his people. Because Elias Thornwell had been born enslaved in Virginia in 1828. He'd been freed by his owner's will in 1851 and had spent the next decade working as a blacksmith in Philadelphia, building a life and a family. When the war began, he'd enlisted in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first official African-American units, believing that military service would help secure full citizenship and rights for his people. He'd died believing he'd failed. But whatever had brought him back, whether it was divine intervention, some unknown scientific phenomenon, or something darker that he refused to contemplate, had given him the means to complete his mission. By June 1865, Thornwell's activities had attracted attention from both federal authorities and former Confederate forces, who viewed him as a symbol of Northern oppression. The Freedmen's Bureau wanted to use him as an official enforcer, while former Confederate officers wanted him dead. Both groups began tracking his movements, trying to predict where he would appear next. On June 14th, Thornwell arrived at the Blackwood Plantation, one of the largest estates in Wilcox County, covering 4,800 acres and worked by 240 enslaved people before the war. The owner, Colonel Richmond Blackwood, had declared that he would never free his slaves and that anyone attempting to enforce emancipation would be met with lethal force. Blackwood had prepared extensively. He'd gathered 50 armed men, fortified his house, and spread word throughout the county that he would make an example of Thornwell that would discourage any other federal agents from attempting similar enforcement actions. Thornwell rode up to the Blackwood plantation at noon on June 15th in full daylight, making no attempt at concealment or tactical advantage. He stopped at the main gate and dismounted, walking forward until he stood within clear rifle range of the fortified house. "Richmond Blackwood," he called out. "I'm here to enforce federal emancipation law. You have until sunset to release every enslaved person on this property. This is your only warning." Blackwood appeared on the porch, surrounded by armed men. He was a massive figure, 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing perhaps 280 pounds. With the bearing of someone who had commanded troops in combat and who possessed absolute confidence in his ability to win through force. "I know who you are," Blackwood shouted back, "and I know what you've done at other plantations. But this isn't the Howell place with its poorly trained militia, and I'm not Marcus Wardlaw who folds when threatened. I've fought in 11 major engagements, survived Antietam and Gettysburg, and led charges against fortified positions that killed better men than you. If you don't leave immediately, we will kill you and bury your body so deep no one will ever find it." Thornwell stood silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice carrying across the distance with unnatural clarity. "I died once already. Burial doesn't frighten me. Last chance, Colonel. Release your slaves or face the consequences." Blackwood raised his hand in a signal. 50 rifles aimed at Thornwell. The distance was perhaps 75 yards, long for pistols but well within rifle range. Any normal person would have been dead the moment they fired. "Kill him," Blackwood ordered. The volley was enormous, 50 rifles firing nearly simultaneously in a thunderclap that seemed to shake the air. Smoke obscured the area where Thornwell had been standing. For a moment, everyone assumed he was dead, torn apart by the concentrated fire. Then the smoke cleared, and Thornwell was still standing, completely unharmed. The ground around him was torn up by impacts, and his coat had several new holes, but his body showed no wounds. He looked down at himself as if mildly surprised, then looked back up at the men on the porch. "My turn," he said quietly. What happened next was described differently by everyone who witnessed it, but certain facts were consistent across all accounts. Thornwell drew both pistols and began walking toward the house, firing as he advanced. The men on the porch returned fire, shooting as fast as they could reload their single-shot rifles. None of their bullets hit him, all of his hit targets. He killed 18 men in the time it took him to cross 75 yards. Every shot was fatal. Headshots primarily, though some hit center mass when heads were not visible. He moved through the return fire like it didn't exist, and the bullets that should have killed him seemed to miss by fractions of inches or pass through his coat without touching flesh. By the time he reached the porch, the survivors had broken and fled. Only Blackwood remained, standing with a pistol in his hand, staring at Thornwell with the expression of someone confronting something their mind couldn't process. "You're dead," Blackwood whispered. "You should be dead. I saw bullets hit you, I am dead," Thornwell agreed. "I died at Chancellorsville, but I'm still here because the work isn't finished. Free your slaves, Colonel. Now." Blackwood raised his pistol with a shaking hand and fired point-blank at Thornwell's chest. The bullet struck exactly where it was aimed, directly over the heart. Thornwell looked down at the new hole in his coat, then back up at Blackwood. "That's where the first one killed me," he said conversationally. "The bullet that ended my life hit exactly there. tore through my lung, lodged against my spine. I felt it happening, felt myself dying, felt everything slipping away. And then I came back. I don't know why. I don't know what I am now. But I know what I have to do. He grabbed Blackwood by the throat and lifted him off his feet with one hand. The colonel was a massive man, but Thornwell held him as easily as someone might hold a child. No visible strain or effort in the action. "You have a choice, Colonel," Thornwell continued, his voice remaining quiet and conversational despite the violence of his action. "You can free every person you're holding illegally, or I can break your neck and free them myself. The outcome is the same, but one option lets you live. Choose." Blackwood made a strangled sound that might have been agreement. Thornwell dropped him, and the colonel collapsed onto the porch, gasping for air. The liberation of the Blackwood plantation took the rest of the day and into the evening. 240 people gathered their belongings and prepared to depart. Thornwell spoke with each group, providing information about the Freedmen's Bureau, about legal rights, about resources available in Camden and larger towns. He was patient and thorough, his earlier violence seemingly forgotten or set aside in service of this gentler duty. As night fell and the last groups departed, one elderly woman approached Thornwell. Her name was Sarah, and she had been enslaved on the Blackwood plantation for 63 years, since she was 7 years old. "Are you an angel?" she asked quietly. Thornwell looked at her for a long moment before responding. "No, ma'am. I'm something else. Something that shouldn't exist but does anyway. You freed us. The law freed you. I just enforced it." Sarah studied his face, which remained largely shadowed beneath his hat. "What happens to you now? Where do you go?" "There are other counties, other plantations, other people who need the law enforced." He paused. "I'll go until the work is finished or until whatever keeps me moving stops working. And then I'll finally get to rest." Sarah reached out and touched his hand. Her fingers felt warm against his skin, which he realized with surprise was cold. Abnormally cold, as if whatever animated him generated no heat. "Thank you," she said simply. "Whatever you are, whatever made you this way, thank you for using it to help us." Thornwell said nothing. He simply nodded once, then walked to his horse and rode away into the darkness, leaving behind a plantation in chaos and freed people trying to understand what liberation meant in practical terms. The months that followed saw Thornwell moving through Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and the Carolinas, enforcing emancipation at dozens of plantations. His methods remained consistent: arrive, deliver the legal notice, wait for compliance or resistance, respond with overwhelming violence if necessary, oversee the liberation process, and depart for the next location. The death toll mounted. By September 1865, conservative estimates suggested Thornwell had killed more than 60 men in the course of his enforcement actions. Liberal estimates put the number closer to 100. Federal authorities were deeply conflicted. His actions were legal under the broad enforcement powers granted by the Emancipation Notice, but the level of violence was disturbing even to those who supported aggressive enforcement. Former Confederate forces began organizing specifically to stop him. Informal militias formed, tracking his movements and trying to ambush him. All such attempts failed. Thornwell seemed to possess an uncanny ability to anticipate traps, and the few times ambushes were successfully sprung, he survived through what witnesses described as impossible luck. Bullets that missed by fractions of inches, weapons that misfired at crucial moments, tactical advantages that somehow failed to produce expected results. Rumors about his true nature spread throughout the South. Some said he was a voodoo priest who had made pacts with dark powers. Others claimed he was a demon sent to punish slaveholders for their sins. A few insisted he was a new kind of weapon developed by the federal government. some form of animated corpse controlled by mechanical means. The truth, that he was something even stranger than any of the rumors suggested, remained known only to Thornwell himself and to a very few observers who had seen him shot and watched the wounds fail to bleed. In October 1865, Thornwell disappeared. His last confirmed appearance was at the Crawford plantation in South Carolina on October 23rd, where he enforced emancipation with his usual efficiency. After that, nothing. No reports, no sightings, no incidents that bore his characteristic methods. Federal authorities conducted an investigation trying to determine what had happened to their most effective enforcement agent. They found his horse grazing beside a creek in western Georgia, still carrying his saddle, but with no sign of Thornwell himself. The crossed gun belts lay carefully arranged on a flat rock nearby, both pistols still loaded. The presidential letter was folded neatly beside them. No body was ever found. No evidence of struggle appeared in the area. Thornwell had simply ceased to exist, as mysteriously as he had begun his campaign of enforcement. The formerly enslaved people who had witnessed his actions developed various theories. Some believed he had completed his mission and been allowed to finally rest. Others thought he had moved on to other work, perhaps in different regions or perhaps in realms beyond human understanding. A few claimed to have seen him in the years that followed, a tall figure in black watching from tree lines, a silent presence at night ensuring that freedom remained real. The Freedmen's Bureau, in their official report dated December 1865, noted that Agent Thornwell's enforcement actions resulted in the liberation of approximately 3,800 enslaved persons across 5 states, with a total financial impact to former slaveholders estimated at $1.9 million, based on pre-war valuation of human property. His methods, while controversial, proved highly effective in ensuring compliance with emancipation law in regions where more conventional enforcement had failed. What the report didn't mention was the growing file of testimonies describing impossible survivability, supernatural abilities, and behavior that suggested Thornwell was something other than human. Those documents were classified and sealed, marked for review only by senior officials with special clearance. The plantation owners who had survived encounters with Thornwell were unanimous in their descriptions. He was something that wore human form, but had long since ceased to be human in any meaningful sense. They spoke of his absolute lack of emotion, his mechanical precision, his apparent inability to be killed or even injured in any permanent way. Some had nightmares for the rest of their lives, waking in darkness, convinced they could hear his quiet voice delivering the same message: comply or die, law or violence, freedom or destruction. In 1873, a researcher named Thomas Pemberton, the same clerk who had provided Thornwell with his first list of plantations back in 1865, published a carefully documented account of the enforcement campaign. He had tracked down witnesses, collected testimonies, and attempted to separate facts from legends. His conclusion was cautious but clear. Whatever Elias Thornwell was, whether human, supernatural entity, or something between these categories, he accomplished what conventional military occupation and legal enforcement had largely failed to achieve. He made freedom real in places where it had remained theoretical. He demonstrated that the law had consequences, even for those who believed themselves beyond its reach. And he did so through methods that terrified both the people who opposed emancipation and many who supported it. His legacy is one of liberation achieved through methodical violence, of law enforced through means that were themselves barely lawful, of an end that justified means most people preferred not to contemplate too closely. The book was quietly suppressed by federal authorities who believed its publication might encourage vigilante action or undermine confidence in legal institutions. Only a few copies survived, held in private collections or buried in archives where they gathered dust alongside other inconvenient truths. But the stories persisted. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, People in the South occasionally reported seeing a tall figure in black, watching from the edges of gatherings where racial violence was planned or perpetrated. Lynchings were sometimes interrupted by unexplained incidents, ropes that broke without apparent cause, crowds that scattered in sudden panic, ringleaders who were found dead the next morning with no clear explanation for their deaths. No proof ever connected these incidents to Thornwell, and most historians dismissed them as folklore created by communities that needed to believe in protective figures during periods of terror. But the pattern was suggestive. Wherever violence threatened to resurrect the old order, wherever freedom seemed at risk of becoming mere theory again, strange things happened, and people who had survived encounters with Thornwell swore they recognized his methods in the outcomes. The pistols he had carried, those two Colt 1851 Navy revolvers that had delivered so much death in service of liberation, were never found. The crossed gun belts recovered in Georgia contained different weapons, older and less well-maintained. Some believed Thornwell had kept the original pistols, carrying them into whatever realm or reality he had moved on to. Others suggested they had been taken by someone who understood their significance, hidden away to prevent them from becoming tools of future violence. In 1923, Sarah Washington, the elderly woman who had spoken with Thornwell at the Blackwood plantation, gave an interview shortly before her death at age 94. She was asked whether she believed the stories about Thornwell being something more than human. "I don't know what he was," she said carefully. "I touched his hand that night and it was cold. Not cool like someone who's been out in the evening air, but cold like something that's been dead for a while. His eyes, when you looked into them, were empty. Not cruel or angry, just empty, like looking into holes where a person should be, but isn't anymore." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "But I know what he did. He freed us. He made freedom real, when it was just words on paper that white folks were ignoring. He killed people who needed killing, who would have kept us in chains forever if someone hadn't stopped them. So I don't care what he was. I care what he did. And what he did was give us a chance to be human beings instead of property." That interview was Sarah Washington's last public statement. She died 3 days later, peacefully in her sleep, having lived long enough to see her grandchildren and great-grandchildren born into a world where slavery was illegal, even if equality remained more theoretical than real. The official historical record treats Elias Thornwell as a footnote if it mentions him at all. Federal enforcement agent, active 1865, exact disposition unknown, responsible for significant violence in service of emancipation law. The truth, that he was something that shouldn't have existed, that violated every understanding of life and death, that used supernatural abilities in service of legal authority, remains buried in classified files and suppressed testimonies. But the stories persist. And occasionally, even now, people in certain parts of the South claim to see a tall figure in black, watching from tree lines or standing on back roads after dark. The figure never speaks, never approaches, just watches. And when morning comes, it's always gone, leaving no tracks, no evidence it was ever there. Is it Elias Thornwell, still wandering after more than 150 years, still watching to ensure freedom remains real? Or is it just shadow and imagination, the projection of cultural memory onto empty darkness? No one knows with certainty. But the crossed gun belts, those two holsters positioned in an X pattern, have become a symbol recognized in certain communities. A reminder that the law sometimes requires enforcement through means that make people uncomfortable, that freedom was purchased with blood, and that some debts are paid by those who cannot rest until justice is achieved. The presidential letter, the one signed by Lincoln 3 days before his assassination, was eventually recovered and placed in the National Archives. Researchers who have examined it note unusual properties. The paper remains pristine despite its age, showing none of the yellowing or deterioration that would be expected from a document more than 150 years old. The ink appears fresh, as if the letter were written yesterday rather than in 1865. And some people who have held the document report feeling a strange coldness emanating from it, as if something of Thornwell's nature has soaked into the paper and remains there, waiting. In the end, Elias Thornwell remains what he was in life and death. A mystery, a possibility, a suggestion that the boundaries between justice and violence, law and vengeance, human and something else, are less clear than comfortable philosophy suggests. He enforced emancipation through methods that would have been war crimes in any other context, killed dozens or hundreds in service of liberation, and either died or departed or transformed into something even stranger than what he had already become. The files remain sealed in the archives, the testimonies gather dust, the stories continue to be told. And somewhere in the darkness, perhaps, a figure still watches, still waits, still remembers what it means to serve a law that requires absolute commitment, even beyond death itself.
They say just forget. Move on like it's easy. But forgetting you feels like remembering someone I've never seen. I've been trying to erase you from the places in my mind, but the harder that I fight it, the more you're hard to leave behind. Every memory keeps slipping through the cracks I try to close, like a face I should remember, but somehow never know. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Every moment turns to fragments, every thought just fades to blue, like I'm searching for a feeling that still only leads to you. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. But now every empty moment still reminds me what is real. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Some days feel off, like I'm standing but still falling. A little pain, a little tired, and no one to tell it all to. There are days that feel unsteady, like I'm drifting out of place. Every step just feels so heavy, with a smile I have to fake. A little hurt I keep inside me, a little weight I always had, and 1,000 quiet worries I've been holding deep inside. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you. I keep walking through the silence like it's all I've ever known. Every crowded room reminds me how it feels to be alone. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you. Maybe one day I'll be stronger, maybe I'll learn how to speak, but for now I keep it buried in the parts of me too weak. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you.